Hello, and welcome to our session today on analyzing qualitative data. Today, we'll be exploring how to make sense of rich, detailed data we gather through interviews and other qualitative methods like interviews and observation. Qualitative data analysis is like solving some kind of a big puzzle. And in this puzzle, we have pieces of data which we may have generated from interview transcripts, field notes, documents. And here, our job is to find meaningful patterns and insights within the various data we have gathered. Now, the process of qualitative data analysis, it starts even before our interview ends. And so as researchers, when we are interviewing, we may already be noticing patterns, and we may be making mental notes of some recurring themes, and maybe we may be identifying areas that will need deeper exploration. So when we are thinking of qualitative data analysis, I would urge that we always think of it like peeling an onion. You have to work through layers of different kinds of meaning. But the first thing is we always try to familiarize ourselves with the data. And we do this through careful reading. Then we start by coding. By coding, we mean we try to see how we can identify key patterns or sometimes themes. And then finally, we interpret these patterns to understand what it is telling us about our research questions or the research phenomena we are investigating. But there's one common challenge in managing qualitative data because of its sheer volume. So for instance, a single hour of a long interview might generate up to, say, between 20 to 30 pages of transcript. And because of this, we need a very systematic approach to organizing and analyzing this kind of data. So in this session, we will explore specific techniques that we can use to analyze qualitative data. Techniques such as coding, content analysis, discourse analysis, hermeneutics. But more specifically in this session, we are going to be concentrating on the coding. Now, the objective of this session is that at the end of the presentation, you should be able to understand the fundamental principles of qualitative coding. You should be able to perform open, axial, and selective coding. And you should also appreciate the practical strategies that you can use to implement coding in your research process. We'll also look at some common challenges and their solution. Now, when we say qualitative coding, what do we mean? What do we mean? Now, the moment you hear of coding, it is not about computer programming. This is actually a really fascinating method we can use in qualitative research to make sense of all that rich textual data we have collected. So what exactly is qualitative coding? Well, you can think of it like being, maybe, as I have always indicated in previous sessions, think like a detective with a huge pile of interview transcripts, with a huge pile of field notes or other text data. And your job is to systematically go through it carefully, all of this data, and then start to make what? Sense of it. When we say qualitative coding, here's actually what we are doing. First, we are going to be trying to organize all the textual data which we have gathered, and which, let's be honest, it can feel really overwhelming, especially when you have transcribed various, several hours of audio into text transcript. So it's like sorting through a massive or a very big puzzle. But what we are doing is we are trying to create a system to help us understand what we have got. And then the next thing is we start looking for patterns. That's the next thing. You might notice that several participants keep mentioning something, maybe a similar experience, or you may start seeing connections between different parts of your data. It's really exciting when these patterns start to emerge as part of our engagement with the data. However, the ultimate goal is this. The ultimate goal is we are building a theoretical understanding from the raw data. That's what we're trying to do. We are taking all these individual pieces of information, and then we are constructing something which will be meaningful from that data. Okay. Now, how can we go about coding? Now that we understand what qualitative coding is, let's look at how we can actually do it. There are three main stages in the coding process, and they build on each other like steps on a ladder. So the three stages we're going to look at would be open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. Let's start with the first one, open coding. Open coding basically involves breaking down text data into initial concepts. And we say that with open coding, this is where everything starts. This is where everything begins. You have to think of this as the first, as you are going through the transcript, your first read through of your transcript of your data. This is where you start breaking everything down into initial concepts. Now we can liken this process to something like unpacking a big box, and then you try to lay out all the pieces on a table. You are looking at your interviews, your interview transcripts, or your field notes, and then you are saying, okay, what's actually happening here? You are confused, and you are asking, what's actually happening here? Then you ask yourself also, what are the basic ideas I'm seeing by looking at this data? This is when we say that you are breaking everything down into what? Initial concepts. Then the next thing is you move to the axial coding. And this is where things get really interesting. At axial coding, you are starting to see how all the pieces, the initial concepts fit together. You are making connections between the concepts you identified in open coding. Maybe you notice that every time participants talk about something, say stress at work, they also mention maybe how long the time they spend to get to work, the time they spend to get to work. And that's the kind of connection we are looking at this particular stage. At the stage of axial coding, we are looking for these connections. Then finally, we reach selective coding. This is where we identify our core themes. We are looking at the big picture here. The big picture ideas we are looking for from our data starts when we are doing selective coding. And this is where we really capture what's going on in our data. So you have to think of it like stepping back from that puzzle you have been working on all along, and then trying to see the complete image by stepping back. Okay. Now, there's something interesting about this whole process. You realize that each stage builds upon the previous one. And and this process is structured in such a way that it will help you to create a deeper understanding of your data. So you can't jump straight into identifying core themes at the selective coding stage without first breaking down the data and making those important connections. So when we are talking about coding, especially using open coding, axial coding, and selective coding, it's like building a pyramid. You need a strong foundation before you can do what? You can reach the top. Now, let's take time to look at it deeper. And we'll start with the first one, open coding. Open coding is where your journey with qualitative analysis actually begins. So you have to think of it as your first date with your data. This is where you get to know it intimately. And then you try to understand what the data is really telling you, what the data is saying. Open coding is exactly what it sounds like. It is open because you are approaching your data with what? With an open mind, and you make sure you are ready to discover whatever emerges from the data. Because this is your first detailed interaction with your data. And here you are trying to identify and then label the distinct units of what? Of meaning. Now, let me walk you through the process in a methodological way, but we'll do it slowly so that it doesn't intimidate you. First, what you have to do is you have to read through your data line by line. That's the first thing. And I mean, really read it, not just skimming through. You take your time and read it line by line. Every sentence could contain important information. That's why you need to read it line by line. So imagine you are, say, looking for gold. You need to examine each bit carefully before you can discover the gold. And that is what you have to have as your first step. Then you create initial labels for the chunks of data you are reading through. Maybe someone in your interview talked about feeling stressed about deadlines. You may decide to label that as workplace pressure or maybe time management challenges. These labels are your first attempt at making sense of what's happening in the data. That's your first attempt at making sense of what's happening in your data. Then here's really another important tip you have to keep in mind. You always have to stay close to the actual words you used or actual words you captured as part from your participants. The words your participants use, you have to stay close to that. Don't jump to theoretical concepts too quickly. Just stick to what they told you. If your participant talked about feeling overwhelmed with emails, you don't have to try to immediately code it as maybe communication. Maybe you can say communication or maybe communication overload, or even maybe more technically communication overload syndrome. Just stick to what they said. Stick with their language when you are doing open coding. And then finally, what you also have to do is you have to write memos about your observations as you are engaging with the data. These are like your research diary entries. Just make personal notes. Then, for instance, you could write what patterns you are noticing and what has surprised you about your engagement with the data, what questions are coming up. All these memos will be incredibly valuable later when you are conducting your analysis. Then let me show you what open coding looks like by taking you through an example in practice. Now, this is important because it will help make everything we have discussed more concrete. So here we have a quote from an interview with a student about their online learning experience. So let's use that to demonstrate how we break this down. So the student is telling us, and let's go through it together. I found it really hard to focus during online classes because there were so many distractions at home. My younger siblings were always running around, and I couldn't find a quiet place to study. I couldn't find a quiet space to study. Now, watch how we are going to create our initial codes from this single quote. We are going to identify distinct units of meaning from this particular quote. First, let's look at the first. When they say really hard to focus, and I've highlighted that in red, I found it really hard to focus. We can code this as maybe concentration difficulty. We can code that portion as concentration difficulty because this captures the core challenge they are expressing. Then let's come to the next. When they mention distractions at home, maybe we can label this as home environment challenges. Then notice how we are creating a slightly broader category that could potentially capture other home-related issues we might find in other interviews with other participants. Now, there's also the mention of siblings running around. So the mention of siblings running around can become family interference. And this is more specific than just maybe general home environment issues. It's about family members directly impacting their study. So we can code siblings running around as what? Family interference. Then finally, there's another label we can give. There's a portion which says couldn't find a quiet space. Couldn't find a quiet space. That one can become maybe lack of space. This is a distinct issue from the other challenges. That's why we're coding that differently. It's about physical space rather than what? The distractions of other siblings running around. Now, you would see how from just one sentence, we have identified 4 different concepts. This is what we mean by staying close to the data. But when we do stay close to the data, we begin to organize it in meaningful units, so that each code will represent a distinct issue. And this distinct issue might connect to maybe broader patterns we'll discover as we continue to analyze more data. Now, let's move on to stage 2. Stage 2 is axial coding. Now, if open coding was about breaking down our data, Axial coding is about putting it back together in a meaningful way. So I want you to think of it like solving a puzzle. You have got all these pieces from open coding, and now we want to figure out how they are going to what? They are going to fit together. So let me walk you through axial coding process. First, we start by grouping related open codes. Now, using our previous example about online learning, you will notice that concentration difficulty and lack of steady space are related in a way. And so they are both, because they are both about barriers to effective studying. This is where you start seeing patterns emerging. Then we move on. We create categories. And categories are broader umbrellas that encompass multiple codes. So those codes about steady barriers. So they might go into another category we call maybe learning environment challenges. It's like creating chapters in a book. That's what all this is about. What's the bigger story these codes are telling us? We have to keep asking ourselves. Then it gets interesting here. We identify the relationships between the categories we are putting up. Maybe we notice that learning environment challenges often connect to what? Family dynamics, or that physical space issues may relate to what? Time management problems. These connections can help us to understand, it can help us to understand the bigger picture. Then finally, we have to also consider what? Context and conditions. Then we have to ask, what circumstances influence these relationships? Maybe the challenges are different for students in apartments versus students in houses, or for those with younger versus those with older siblings. So context can help us a lot. Context can help us understand when and why certain patterns are occurring. So you have to think of it like being, as I keep saying, you always have to think like a detective, trying to connect evidence on one issue to another. But and in doing this, you are using strings to show how everything relates to each other. You are not just collecting clues anymore. You are trying to do what? Build a theory by looking at how things are what? Are connected to each other. Now, let's see how axial coding works with our online learning example. This is where we start seeing the bigger picture emerge from all those individual codes we created earlier. Okay, so let's look at how we would group our codes in a broader category. First, we mentioned that we have environmental challenges. Remember all those individual codes we created earlier. Remember that. Concentration difficulty, home environment challenges, family interference, and lack of steady space. All of this can fit under one umbrella. And they are all about, because they are all about external factors that are affecting the learning experience. Then we have another category. We can say the other category, maybe we can label it as learning adaptability. And this will include things like recording advantage and learning flexibility. These codes represent how students adapted to their circumstances. You see how it works. So when we do this, we will see that both the problems and the solutions are emerging from what? From our data. But also, I want to caution you, this is where axial coding can get a bit more interesting. Look at the relationships we have identified. If you look at it carefully, you may notice a clear pathway, environmental challenges leading to what? Impacts on what? On learning, which then will push students to develop adaptation strategies. You see, it's like some kind of a domino effect. So, for example, a student might face family interference, and that will be an environmental challenge, which can affect their ability to concentrate during live classes. That will be an impact on learning. So they will start relying on more recorded lectures, which will be what? An adaptation strategy. You see how everything is what? Is trying to connect to each other. And this is what makes axial coding very powerful. When we are doing axial coding, we are not just listing problems as we have done. We are understanding how different aspects of the online learning experience are interacting with what? With each other. And then we'll begin to see the story behind the data. Now, we have reached stage 3, and stage 3 is selective coding. This is where everything actually comes together. You have to think of it as finding the headline of your research story. What's the big picture? That's what you have to ask yourself. What's the big picture that connects everything we have discovered? Now, to understand selective coding very well, let me walk you through the process, the final process. First, in selective coding, we have to review all categories and relationships we identify during axial coding. And this is more or less like spreading out all of our puzzle pieces on the table another time. But now we can see how they are all connected. Then comes the exciting part. We try to identify the core phenomena we are investigating. This is the central theme that keeps showing up in our data. For example, in our online learning example, maybe we discovered that learning environment adaptation is the core story. How students actively shape their learning experiences in response to what? In response to challenges. Once we have this core phenomenon, we can then connect other categories to it. So for instance, how does everything else relate to this main story? Maybe environmental challenges are the conditions that trigger adaptation, while learning flexibility represents the strategies the students may use. Then the next thing is we need to be able to do what? Validate these relationships. We have to ask questions like, are we sure this is really what is happening with our data? Are we sure this is really what is happening in our data? We might have to go back to our original interview transcripts to verify that our big picture story that we are now getting truly represent what the participant actually told us. So you see that this can be an iterative kind of a process. And then finally, we refine categories as needed. Sometimes when you see the big picture, you will realize that some categories need to be adjusted to better fit the overall story. And so this is more or less like being a documentary maker. You have gathered all the footage you can gather. That is the open coding part, and you have organized it into several scenes. This can be likened to axial coding. And now you are putting together the final clip that will tell the compelling or the central story of what we have actually found. So 3 stages: open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. Now, let's talk about some practical implementation issues. How do we put all of this into practice? The theory is beautiful, it's great, but you may be wondering, how do I actually do this? The key to a successful qualitative coding is that you have to stay organized from the beginning. So let me share some practical tips about creating a coding framework, which will make your life much, much easier as an MPhil or a PhD candidate. First, you may want to use a structured coding sheet. So think of this as your research notebook or command center. So you can also use Excel to do this. You can use Excel to do this, or maybe you can use a qualitative analysis software like NVivo, or even maybe a well-organized Word document can help you do this. Whatever works well for you should be used, as long as it is what? It is systematic. Then in your coding sheet, you have to include columns for all your coding stages. You may want to place, you may want to put a place or have a place for your initial open codes, another one for your axial coding categories, and another one for your selective coding teams. So when you have everything in one place, it can help you see how your analysis is going to evolve. So you can have maybe you can have 3 columns in your coding sheet: initial open codes, axial coding categories, and then the selective coding teams. Now, another important thing: always add space for memos and notes. Trust me, you will have insights and questions popping up when you are doing your coding. And it is important that when you have these questions and insights popping up, you should be able to make memos or notes about them, because you have to provide a place to capture these thoughts. These notes often can become a gold mine. They can become gold mines for you, especially when you are writing up your findings later. Then finally, what you have to do is you have to track your changes and your decisions carefully. Then, for instance, questions like, why did you merge these two categories? You have to make notes about that. What made you choose this particular core team? You have to document what reasoning you had at that time. It's like you can't leave everything to chance. You have to document everything carefully. Now, as part of the qualitative research process, you can rely on powerful software tools that can make your qualitative coding process much more efficient. Uh, you can code with basic tools like Word or Excel, as I've indicated, but these specialized programs can offer new features that can enhance your analysis. And Vivo is one, and is the most widely used qualitative analysis software in academia. Now, what's great about NVivo is that it handles pretty much any type of data you put in there or you throw at it. So it could either be text, audio, video, social media data, anything. It's practically good at handling large data sets and creating different kinds of visualizations of your coding patterns. Then there's also Atlas TI. Atlas TI is another powerful option. And what I like about Atlas TI is that it has a network view feature. It's good for axial coding because it helps you visualize relationship between your codes and the categories. It's also really good at handling collaborative projects if you are working with other people in the team. Then we have MaxQDA, which may be less well known, but it's garnering a lot of attention these days. But it's also very user friendly. If you are new to qualitative data analysis software, you may want to try out MaxQDA because it has a much more gentler learning curve, and it's very good, especially if you are doing mixed methods research. If you are combining qualitative and quantitative approach, what you have to understand is that each of these tools has got its strengths and weaknesses. The best choice actually depends on your specific needs, the kind of data you are working with. Are you working alone or you are working with some other people? What your budget is and all that. All these are very important. Now, let's talk about some quality control issues in coding. Quality control issues in coding. This is actually about ensuring your research is robust and trustworthy. As a researcher, when you conduct research, when you have completed your research results must be trusted. So you have to think of it as your research quality assurance system. The first thing is maintaining a detailed code book. This is like your research dictionary. It defines each code and gives examples explaining when you have used it or when you should use it. So when you have a good code book, it means that anyone who looks at your research can understand exactly how and why you coded things the way you did it. It's not just helpful for others. It will be helpful for you too. Maybe later, when you are reviewing your work, maybe several months down the line. Then we have the second issue, which is the regular code review. It's also very important. You just don't code everything and then check it at the end. You have to review your work regularly, maybe after every few interviews or documents. You might notice patterns you missed or realize that some codes need adjusting. It's like editing a paper as you go rather than waiting until the final data. When possible, you may work with multiple coders, and this can be valuable because different people might see different things. Maybe for the purpose of your PhD, you may not be working with multiple coders. So yeah, so we will not concentrate much on that. Then we also have the issue of intercoder reliability check, basically making sure different coders are consistent with each other. This also has to do with you working as part of a team. Finally, you have to keep detailed documentation of everything you are doing, your decision-making processes, the changes you are making to your course, where you merge or split certain categories. Then also think of it as writing some kind of maybe the behind-the-scenes story of your research. That's basically what you do with the detailed documentation. Document everything, because this transparency is very important for the credibility of your qualitative research findings. Of course, you would have some challenges. There will be some challenges you would face in your qualitative coding process. So every researcher encounters this at some point. So let's look at challenge one. The challenge one is the most dreaded. You may have too many codes, and we call it the too many codes syndrome. You start coding so enthusiastically when you have done some interviews, and suddenly you realize that you have got different hundreds of what? Of codes. It can be very confusing. What is the solution? The solution is regular code review. That's the solution. Regular code review and merging some of the codes. Very important. You don't have to let the codes multiply like hell. Create hierarchical relationships by grouping similar codes together, and always keep your research questions in focus. Keep going back to your research questions and checking. If a code isn't helping you to answer your research questions, maybe the code is not essential. You may have to merge it with another code, or you completely drop it. Then we also have challenge two, which is inconsistent coding. This is especially common when you are working with the team, or maybe even if you are working by yourself for a long period, say on a PhD. The solution is to ensure that you have a clear coding rule from the beginning. You have to write detailed description of what each code means. If you are working as a PhD candidate, you may have to sit with your supervisor and try to talk some of these things through, so that you having this regular review sessions with your supervisor can really help you. If you are working alone, you have to take breaks and maybe come back with fresh eyes, fresh ideas to check, to make sure that you are very consistent. And the last one is getting lost in the details. It is easy to lose focus. It's easy. And what's the solution? Keep your research questions visible so that you can always go back to it. Literally go back to it, check them, post them on your wall. Make sure you are always reminded so that you can have, you can even use visual mapping to see the bigger picture of how everything is connecting. Then you can write analytical memos as you go. And all this will help you. All this would help you a lot. All this will help you a lot. Now, I want you to take some time to try these practical exercises based on what we have explained in terms of how you can code, you can identify open codes, axial categories, and then what? Develop a selective team. And the sample data is this particular code. The pandemic changed how I approach my studies. Initially, I struggled with time management since all my classes were online. But after a few weeks, I developed a strict schedule and found that I actually became more organized than before. Now, look at this very carefully. Look at this very carefully. And I would want you to pause and then try to see if you can identify some open codes, if you can create some axial categories, if you can develop a selective team, so that we'll compare with what I'm about to tell you. So let's start with step one, open coding. Looking at this particular code, what distinct ideas or concepts do we see? What do we see? So you would see that the first sentence, the pandemic changed how I approach my studies. So just looking at pandemic changed how I approach. If you just look at that, pandemic changed how I approach. We can label that as what? Impact of the pandemic, or just pandemic impact. Then as we move on, you will see I struggle with time management. Then we can say struggle with time management can be what? An initial struggle. So I can label it as what? Initial struggle. I can label it as initial struggle. Then it went on, since all my classes were online. So all my classes were online. That is what? An online migration or online transition. So we can code that as online transition. Then it goes on. But after a few weeks, so we can code that as maybe adaptation process. After a few weeks, there's going to be a change. Adaptation process. We can code that as adaptation process. I developed a strict schedule. So developed a strict schedule can be what? Schedule development. We can label that as schedule development. and found that I actually became more organized than before. So we have became more organized than before can be labeled as what? Improved organization. Now that we have identified our open codes, we move to step 2, axial coding. Let's group these codes we have identified into broader categories and identify their relationships. So for me, I suggest category 1 would be what? Challenges. So that our challenges would be pandemic impact, initial struggle with time management, and then online transition. We can also have another category, maybe adaptation strategies. So schedule development, time management solutions, and then last but not the least, we can have category 3, outcomes. What did it lead to? Improved organization, positive transformation. And then finally, we move to the third stage, which is developing a selective team. Step 3, developing a selective team where we do our selective coding. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves here is what's the core team that ties everything together here? Now, the central team appears to be adaptive, some kind of adaptive resilience in an academic crisis, if we want to call it. Because it tells the story of how a challenging situation led to positive personal growth through what? Active adaptation. Now, see how, if you look at it carefully, you will see how we have moved from specific codes to broader categories, and finally to an overarching what? Team. So we can use this, but there's another example I would want you to go through. The second example is to go through this quote. Before starting my remote internship, I was worried about missing out on workplace mentorship. Instead, I found that my supervisor made extra effort to schedule regular video calls and gave me more detailed feedback on my work. The digital format actually forced us to be more intentional about communication, though I do miss casual office conversations. Now, let's see how we can pause and try to see if you can identify open codes yourself, create axial categories, and develop a selective team. We can work through this together. Our open codes, the initial open codes we can identify are the first one, worried about missing out on workplace, worried about missing out. It will be, we can code that as a concern. Then we have workplace mentorship. We can code that as maybe mentorship, or maybe mentorship expectation. And then we have supervisor made extra effort. Supervisor made extra effort. We can code that as maybe supervisor adaptation. Then we also have the supervisor did what? Scheduled regular video calls. Scheduled regular video calls. So that's what? Structured communication. And then we have more detailed feedback and gave me more detailed feedback. How are you going to code this? We can code that as what? Enhanced feedback. Then we also have the digital format actually forced us to be more intentional. Force us to be more intentional can also be coded to say intentional interaction. Intentional interaction. Then the last but not the least, I do miss casual office conversation. Miss casual office conversation can be coded as what? Social loss. Then 2, axial coding. Let's group this into categories and identify relationship. We can have maybe category 1, we can have maybe say professional concerns, which would consist of initial concerns, mentorship expectations. Then category 2, we can have virtual adaptations, which can be supervisor adaptation, structured communication, and then enhanced feedback. Then category 3, communication dynamics. And then that one will be the social loss, missing casual office conversation, social loss, and intentional interaction. When we put all of this together, the core team will appear to be what? You can guess. We can have something like maybe digital transformation of professional mentorship. This is just an example. Your selective coding team may be different from mine, but they may be very, very closely related. This shows how virtual work environments were created, or how it created both new challenges and unexpected benefits in what? And say professional development. This is how practically we can demonstrate how to conduct open coding, axial coding, and then what? Selective coding. Thank you very much.